Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. I feel a bit awkward because it's one thing to actually talk about the things done by Russian businesses and the vision of Russian corporations, say, with Russian officials or Russian corporates, but addressing a lofty audience of people who actually know much better than I do what's happening is quite a challenge. Nonetheless, I'll try to tell you how large corporations today see the challenges and opportunities brought about by the climate agenda. I would also like to say a few words about the challenges related to the energy transition as such, and I will be talking more in my hat of a Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs co-head, as opposed to my head of an executive of Eurochem. Now, the union established a committee on climate regulation about a year ago, and when it was established, there was quite a flurry of, there was substantial interest from numerous companies. Just for your information, roughly 60 biggest corporations of the Russian Federation are represented at the level of this union. And I can assure you that climate-related requests coming to the union from the Russian government over the past year has exceeded and surpassed all the other types of requests. Well, I guess it's partially due to substantial legislative activity in the Russian Federation, because Russia has adopted new laws on reducing emissions and has been preparing for numerous conferences, including the Glasgow COP26. Actually, for the first time ever, such a conference was attended by a very well-represented delegation of Russian corporations, not just officials. And now we are collaborating quite a lot with many Russian scientists, including the Institute for Economic Forecasting and the Oceanology Institute, and many others as well, including, say, experts in Russian forests. And we're also focusing a lot on sharing practices, decarbonization practices between corporations. While at the same time, decarbonization and reduction of emissions are not radically new topics for Russian companies. Many of us have been doing this stuff for many years, but it was haphazard until recently. It was not really institutionalized. We made this calculation that roughly $400 billion had been invested by Russian corporations in total over the past 20 years in various projects targeting a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And these investments, I think, made a significant contribution to the significant reduction in GHG emissions we're seeing in Russia. Over the past 10 years, some of the biggest companies performed another investment cycle. And right now in 2021 and 2022, we are seeing some early results of this investment cycle. I'm not just talking here about increased labor productivity or increase in competitiveness or increase in quality of Russian products. I'm talking here specifically about reduction in our carbon footprint. So this is something that we certainly are going to show very clearly, to articulate it in the next year. Energy intensity of Russian products today is at least comparable to the products you'll see from the developed countries. And actually, emissions of Russian major oil and gas companies are very good, and flaring of associated gas is even lower than what you'll find among the largest oil and gas producers globally. The benchmarking study we conducted for aluminum producers or steel makers shows that Russian corporations are either on par with the average international firm or better than the average one. Well, naturally, relatively low carbon intensity of the Russian power sector plays an important role in that, and roughly 80% of Russian electricity comes from low carbon or zero carbon fuels. And this is great for us because we feel pretty comfortable now that CBAM is becoming a reality. Actually, some companies are going to benefit from this cross-border adjustment mechanism because carbon intensity of some of our rivals, even in Europe, is actually below what we have. And it's something to take into account as Russia develops its own regulation. It certainly doesn't mean we should stop at where we are and simply, continue using the great technologies which were developed back in Soviet times, as well as the results of recent investment projects. Most companies have very ambitious targets for further decarbonization and actually proving and verifying that we have already achieved significant reductions. And the goals that are contained in the recently adopted low carbon development strategy of the Russian Federation, they are actually shared by numerous Russian corporations. The big question is how this strategy is going to be implemented. What will be the specific industrial decarbonization plans to support it? For our own needs, we've tried calculating the kind of potential for further reduction of GHG emissions had by various Russian industries. We've run our calculations for some industries, not all of them, and the numbers we have are slightly different from what you will find in the national low carbon strategy, but they are not different by, say, an order of magnitude. For example, we believe that by 2050, we should be able to reduce emissions by 300 million tons of CO2 equivalent in manufacturing. In transport, it's roughly 250 million tons of CO2 equivalent. In ferrous metallurgy and chemical chemical industry, significant reduction can be achieved in the next decade. We're talking 15 to 20 million tons of reduction. And one of the key factors there is the continuing transformation and upgrade of manufacturing processes, which is a direct result of our investment programs. But there is another lever, which involves what we often call climate projects. And these projects are properly packaged and they are verified by independent international third parties. And they prove that compared to the so-called baseline, the project initiator has been able to achieve lower emissions they would have otherwise. So, according to our assessments, the potential of such climate projects stands at roughly 900 million tons of CO2 equivalent. In this respect, implementation of such climate projects will be further stimulated by the adoption of key implementation principles adopted in Glasgow under Chapter 6 of the Paris Agreement. I should probably stress here that in the Russian Federation there is significant potential for climate projects which are not very costly. I'm talking about less than $10 per ton of CO2 saved. Few countries actually have this kind of potential, and this is our great competitive advantage. Now, some of these projects include methane utilization and increased energy efficiency and reduction of leakage and reduction of fugitive emissions. So these are must-haves. And there are also forest-related projects and LULUCF projects, but we also have the so-called adaptation projects. And in a sense, I'm referring here to Sergei's first presentation, because some of our projects need to take into account the risk of coastal flooding. And as regards future climate regulation, we think it's very important to embrace the principle of technology neutrality. We believe that we need to do things which make the most sense for the Russian economy. That is, we need to assure the largest possible reduction of GHG emissions in the most feasible way, rather than simply embracing the most technologically advanced solutions, which may be sensible in other countries, but may prove to be extremely costly and not very productive for Russia. For example, in Siberia, in order to significantly reduce GHG emissions, we need to stimulate cogeneration, even if it is coal-fired. I mean, coal generation in many countries is already considered a pariah. But in Russia, we can actually spend a relatively small amount of money re-equipping or retrofitting power plants to run in cogeneration mode. And even if they continue firing coal, this will already give us significant emission reductions. I understand there is a certain level of skepticism about climate agenda among Russian corporations, among Russian employees, and it's a peculiar feature of this country, I guess. I believe that this skepticism can be overcome. And the best way to overcome it is to show that reduction of emissions should not be the be-all and end-all. It should be a secondary, though an important objective. We should be showing every time that with these projects, we are, for example, making the environment cleaner, making the air better, because these things do matter. They matter to employees, they matter to executives. And it will be the best way to A, be effective with these projects, and B, make them popular. And we believe that the efforts of the government in this respect, in terms of, say, raising awareness or creating stimuli, will be very important. Actually, CCUS projects are becoming extremely attractive to Russian corporations. Yes, they tend to be very expensive, but the potential they have is colossal. The problem is that very few companies in Russia can afford them at the moment. But if Russian government actually helps them, then we're not asking for much. We're asking for like 20 or 30% offset of investment through stabilization clauses, or maybe subsidized tariffs or direct subsidies even, or maybe some taxation benefits. With this kind of support, CCUS projects will make sense for a bunch of Russian industries even today. For example, in the chemical industry. And Russian state has got the tools for it. I'm talking here, for example, about various programs for supporting corporate competitiveness and the so-called SPIC tool and others. if they are slightly adapted to promote climate agenda, I believe they would actually significantly accelerate climate projects performed and implemented by Russian private corporations. And I can assure you that lots of things have changed in the minds of Russian executives. The subject of decarbonization and climate agenda is now becoming one of the key factors for our planning, our goal setting, our operations. So I can assure you that a lot will be done in the coming years. You will not be ashamed of us. And I do hope that we have developed a pretty good kind of collaboration with the scientific, with the research community, because quality of input information, quality of analysis, the ability to properly present one's analysis also internationally is what we consider very important. And I believe that it's one of the areas where business and research communities have developed a fruitful collaboration. Yes, thank you very much, Sergey. Thank you for your great presentation and for finding the time. We know and appreciate the role that your committee played in articulating Russia's position for Glasgow. I've checked all the publicly available documents stemming from Glasgow, and we're glad that the position, the stance of Russian corporations has been shown pretty clearly there. And I can tell you that I am personally very glad. I was glad to read it because I had my own concerns, and I believe that your committee actually played an important role in articulating it this way. If I may respond very quickly. What happened on the margins of Glasgow would have been impossible without our collaboration with the scientists. I see Sergey Gudov. You know what, Sergey, thank you so much. I actually called Sergey late at night asking for his advice and asking for some information, which we badly needed there. Yes, and Sergey very clearly showed that without global oceans, we won't achieve anything. Difference, if I may. Are you saying something, Sergey? I just wanted to say that for the past year, we've been working in a bunch of working groups. And we've been exposed to Sergey and his peers. And I want to corroborate what Sergey said. You may remember that at the beginning of his presentation, he mentioned that the position of Russian companies is changing and is changing dramatically. I can certainly verify that. Maybe it was not 2, but 3 years ago that I visited one of the corporations represented at the level of the union. They've changed dramatically over this time. When I talked to the executives back then about climate change, they would retort to my concerns by quoting financial newspapers, and they were in denial. Since then, they have changed, and I feel that Russian corporations have changed, and I think it is to a large extent, to a large degree, due to Sergey's contribution, Sergey and his team, naturally. The process of climate change is very complex and it's very difficult to predict. And as professionals, we are allowed to talk about it very honestly. And it's great that we have been able to identify areas where businesses can actually adapt and can, well, often benefit from actually plucking the low-hanging fruit. This is great. I think this is the best and possibly the only way of sensible collaboration between researchers and businesses for the next decade. Now, you've been talking about substantial investments made by Russian corporations, and it's a shame we don't have this kind of precise numbers about the future. It's very difficult, really, to predict what it's going to be like. Like, it's difficult for us to distinguish between 2.4 and 2.7. Sergey, I'm sorry for interrupting you. We shall have a separate discussion, but naturally, everything is changing. It's not just the climate. Business is also changing. The only thing we are not going to change is our agenda. So now we shall turn to another presentation. We'll be talking about specific factors, and Natalia Lukina, who's the head of the Center for Economic Productivity of Forests of Russian Academy of Sciences. So Natalia Lukina, please take the floor.